Hey everyone, and welcome back. Today we're going deep on a topic that pretty much everyone has an opinion on: marriage and divorce.
Oh, yeah, for sure. It's one of those things everyone thinks they know about.
Exactly. And to help us unpack all of it, we're going to be referencing a fascinating interview with James, a pop divorce lawyer, which was featured on the YouTube channel The Diary of a CEO.
This guy's seen it all.
He has, and he doesn't hold back. In fact, right off the bat, he had me thinking differently about the whole marriage thing.
Oh, really? How so?
Well, divorce rates hover around 50%, right?
Yeah, that's about what I've always heard.
Okay, so James compares entering marriage without a solid grasp of the legal implications to, get this, skydiving without proper training.
Oh, wow. I like that analogy.
It definitely makes you think twice, right?
It does,
Yeah.
especially when you consider that the 50% divorce rate only tells part of the story. You also have to factor in all the couples who stay together but are actually miserable. So the failure rate of marriage is probably even higher than we think. So why are we so drawn to it?
Right. Why do we keep taking the plunge? I mean, look, 86% of divorced people remarry within 5 years. What's that about? Are they all just hopeless romantics? Or have they actually learned from their mistakes?
That's where this interview gets really interesting. James suggests that a prenuptial agreement, which a lot of people see as a buzzkill, can actually be a powerful tool for couples.
I've always thought of prenups as kind of admitting defeat before you even begin. Like you're already planning for the relationship to fail.
I totally get that perspective. But what if I told you a prenup isn't about planning for failure? What if it's more about defining the terms of your unique partnership?
Okay, so like instead of just blindly accepting whatever the default legal structures are, you're proactively creating your own rules of engagement as a couple.
Exactly. You're talking about finances, assets, even lifestyle expectations.
You're forcing yourself to have those potentially tricky conversations up front instead of hoping everything will magically sort itself out.
Right. And that can actually strengthen a relationship, getting those potential points of friction out in the open before resentment and misunderstanding have a chance to build up.
So it's not about being cynical or pessimistic. It's about being realistic about the challenges of marriage.
Yeah.
And it's about being proactive in addressing those challenges.
It's exactly. Now, of course, there are some examples of prenups that are kind of out there, like James describes one where a wife's alimony was directly tied to her weight gain.
Wait, what? How did that even work?
Well, for every 10 pounds she gained, her alimony payments decreased by $10,000 per month.
Whoa. Hold on, I need a minute to process that.
I know, right?
I mean, that puts a whole new spin on the in sickness and in health part of the vows.
It definitely does, that's for sure. But this example, as extreme as it is, kind of highlights this whole economic aspect of love that we often overlook. I mean, think about it. What kinds of value do people bring to a relationship?
Yeah, right. And how do we negotiate those values, whether it's consciously or unconsciously?
James actually uses this phrase, love as an economy, which is fascinating, right? Sometimes it's a healthy exchange, but sometimes it leads to these power imbalances, as we saw in that crazy prenup example.
Speaking of power imbalances, what about the whole gold digger stereotype? Does James see that playing out in his work, especially with couples who have significant age or wealth gaps?
It's interesting. He actually cautions against using that term. His view is that all relationships involve some sort of exchange of value.
So instead of assuming someone is just after money, you have to look at what each person is bringing to the table.
Yes. Think about it. Youth, beauty, social status, emotional support, all of these can be forms of currency in the love economy, so to speak.
I like that. Love economy.
Right. The real question is the exchange balanced? Is it fair? Or is one person clearly taking advantage of the other?
That's a great point. I mean, we tend to judge certain types of relationships, like those with big age gaps or wealth disparities, but maybe we're just projecting our own biases and assumptions onto them.
Maybe. And that leads us to another hot button issue: infidelity.
Oh, yeah, everyone's got thoughts on that one.
They do. And Jones has some really interesting thoughts on fidelity clauses in prenups and postnups.
Okay, so for our listeners who aren't familiar, a fidelity clause basically sets up financial penalties for cheating, right?
Right. But James doesn't seem to think they're very effective.
Really? Why not? I would think the threat of losing a bunch of money would be a pretty strong deterrent.
But think about it. Cheating already carries major consequences. The emotional fallout, the damage to the relationship, the impact on the divorce proceedings. I mean, it's a big deal even without a specific clause.
I guess what I'm wondering is, does it actually affect the legal outcome of a divorce if there's no fidelity clause in place?
Not necessarily. Not in most cases, anyway. The point James makes is that infidelity damages trust and intimacy in a way that money just can't fix. And he also brings up this fascinating point about how men and women often view infidelity differently.
Oh, how so?
Well, men, they tend to focus more on the physical act of cheating, whereas women, they're more attuned to the emotional connection behind it.
So, like, a man might be more upset about his wife sleeping with someone else, whereas a woman might be more hurt by her husband developing feelings for another woman.
Yeah, exactly. It's about the different ways men and women experience and prioritize intimacy.
You know, this reminds me of something James said about a friend who was actually relieved when marriage equality passed.
Really?
Because before same-sex marriage was legal, his friend could always get out of the marriage conversation with his partner by saying, well, we can't get married anyway. Once it was legal, though, no more excuses.
Uh-huh. That's a clever way to dodge the issue, but I see your point. It highlights how much pressure there is around
Yeah.
marriage, right? It's this big societal expectation, this supposed happily ever after that everyone's supposed to strive for. But as we're seeing, the reality is a lot more complicated.
It is. And speaking of reality, let's talk about the elephant in the room, sex.
Uh-huh.
I mean, it's a pretty crucial part of most romantic relationships, wouldn't you say?
It is. James actually says it's usually what distinguishes a spouse from just a roommate.
Okay, so how often does sex actually come up as an issue in divorces? I'm curious.
A lot more often than you'd think, actually. James says it's a huge factor and often a symptom of deeper issues within the relationship,
What kind of issues?
like changes in sexual frequency,
Mhm.
That can signal a bunch of different things like lack of desire, intimacy issues, resentment. It can even indicate a breakdown in communication.
So it's not really about the sex itself, it's about what the sex represents.
Right, exactly. And James has this warning that if you don't talk about these issues, if you just try to sweep them under the rug, you risk creating what he calls a death spiral in your relationship.
A death spiral. Okay, that sounds intense. Can you elaborate on that a little? Like, what does that look like in a relationship?
So imagine this. One partner is feeling neglected, sexually neglected, but they don't say anything.
Maybe they're afraid of starting a fight or of hurting their partner's feelings.
Exactly. But then all that unsaid stuff starts to fester, and it manifests in other ways. Maybe they become less affectionate, or they pick fights more often, or they start to withdraw emotionally.
And then it's just this downward spiral.
And that's the death spiral.
Mm.
And it can be really hard to pull out of it once it starts.
It sounds like a slow poison for the relationship, but there must be ways to prevent it.
There are. And this is where James's advice about what he calls preventative maintenance for relationships comes in.
Preventative maintenance. I like that.
Yeah. Just like we service our cars regularly to avoid major problems, we should invest in the health of our relationships.
So what does preventative maintenance for a relationship look like?
Well, it all starts with being proactive about communication. It's about checking in with your partner regularly.
Not necessarily these big sit-down, State of the Union type conversations, right?
Right. More like little check-ins,
Mm.
just to gauge how each other is feeling, what your needs are, making sure you're both still on the same page.
So it's about being proactive and addressing things as they come up instead of waiting for things to blow up.
Yes, exactly. And even when things do get tough, disagreements are inevitable. James has this great mantra: hit send now.
Hit send now. I like that.
Yeah, it's about not overthinking it, just being honest with your partner. And he suggests you actually talk about how you'll handle disagreements when things are good.
Oh, that's interesting. So like having a plan in place for when you inevitably hit a rough patch.
Exactly. Think of it as a communication contract. Setting some ground rules for how you'll navigate those tricky conversations.
So when a disagreement does come up, you're not caught off guard. You have a framework for working through it together.
Exactly. And it's important to remember that these conversations, even when they're about difficult stuff, they should be framed as acts of love, not attacks.
Right. Because you're ultimately on the same team.
Yes. And that brings us to another major cause of divorce: money.
Oh, money, money, money always seems to complicate things.
It does, doesn't it?
Yeah.
But we were talking earlier about the love economy and how it's not always about hardship itself.
Right. You were saying it's often more about a lack of transparency and honesty when it comes to finances.
Exactly. You can have couples that are very well off, but if they're not on the same page about money, they can run into big trouble.
So debt, financial leverage, you're saying even just the illusion of wealth can all play a role in a relationship falling apart?
Absolutely. And, James told this story about a lottery winner.
Oh, I think I heard about this.
Yeah. His wife immediately filed for divorce after he hit the jackpot.
It's crazy, right? You'd think winning millions would bring you closer together.
You'd think so. But it often just magnifies the existing cracks in the relationship. It's like all of a sudden the power dynamics shift,
Yeah.
and all the underlying issues that were simmering beneath the surface come boiling over.
It makes you think, right, about financial disclosure. Like, how much are you obligated to share with your partner about your finances?
It's a complex issue, and it's something that couples really need to talk about openly and proactively, ideally before any major financial changes happen.
Okay, so we've talked about heterosexual couples, but do you think there are any significant differences in the reasons for divorce when it comes to LGBTQ plus couples?
It's a good question. Obviously, LGBTQ plus couples face many of the same challenges as heterosexual couples.
Right, like communication issues, financial stress, infidelity.
All of that. But James has observed that because of their history, because of the marginalization they faced, LGBTQ plus couples may approach commitment and partnership differently.
So maybe they have a different perspective on what it means to be married.
Possibly. But, it's still a relatively new area of study. It's too early to draw any definitive conclusions about long-term trends in LGBTQ plus divorce rates.
It'll be interesting to see how those trends evolve over time. So speaking of evolving relationship models, what about open relationships? Do you think they're any more or less successful than traditional monogamous relationships?
Well, as James points out, he mainly sees the relationships that didn't work out.
Right, because he's a divorce lawyer.
Exactly. So it's hard to say,
Yeah.
based on his experience alone. But he does say that he's seeing more and more couples exploring ethical non-monogamy and polyamory.
I think that's definitely a trend that's gaining more visibility these days. But I wonder if we're being totally honest with ourselves as a society about how common these alternative relationship models actually are.
That's a great point. And I think more research and more open dialogue are needed before we can draw any real conclusions about their long-term success rates.
It's fascinating, isn't it? Just how much we're still learning about relationships. And it makes me wonder, how do you know when a relationship is truly broken? Like, is it just a matter of effort? Or is there a point of no return?
That is the million-dollar question, isn't it? And I think James gives some really good advice here. He says that we tend to compare our real-life relationships to these idealized, often unrealistic portrayals of love and marriage that we see in the media.
Well, totally. Movies, TV shows, social media, we're bombarded with images of perfect couples and fairy tale romances.
Right, and we start chasing this fantasy instead of focusing on building a genuine connection with our partner, flaws and all.
So maybe it's about managing expectations, realizing that real relationships are messy and complicated, and that they require ongoing work and effort.
I think that's a huge part of it. And it's about accepting your partner, loving them for who they are, not who you want them to be.
And speaking of the complexities of relationships, James also talked about something that kind of gave me chills. As a true crime fan, he brought up this statistic. When a wife goes missing, the husband is often the perpetrator.
Oh, wow. Yeah, that is chilling.
It really makes you think, right? About how we can never truly know another person, and how sometimes love and trust can be misplaced.
It's a reminder that we need to be aware, set boundaries, and if something doesn't feel right, seek help.
This conversation has definitely taken some unexpected turns, but it's been so fascinating. James has really seen it all, hasn't he?
He has the good, the bad, the ugly. He really has a front row seat to the full spectrum of human behavior.
So I have to ask, with all the heartbreak and drama he sees in his work, is there anything that's ever made him cry?
He admitted that he's cried both out of frustration and out of beauty at different points in his career.
I can only imagine. Was there a particular story that stuck with him?
He told a story about his father, who was a Vietnam veteran and a recovering alcoholic.
Yes. He mentioned his dad.
Yeah, and, despite all his struggles, his dad showed him love through a small but incredibly powerful act of selflessness.
What did he do? I'm curious.
So James and his best friend were at his house eating pizza, and they pretty much devoured the whole thing, leaving just 2 slices left for his dad. And even though his dad was clearly hungry, he insisted that the boys eat the last 2 slices. Yeah, and that was a turning point for James, because he realized in that moment that his dad loved him deeply, even if he wasn't always able to express it in words.
That's really beautiful.
It is. And, it made him think about how Love shows up in different ways. It's not always about grand gestures. Sometimes it's those little things, those quiet acts of service and
It is
sacrifice.
about recognizing those moments and cherishing them.
Yes. And, that story leads perfectly into the question that our previous podcast guest posed to James. When was the first time you experienced true love?
Oh, that's a good one. I can't wait to hear his answer.
Well, he was visibly moved by the question. And after a pause, he said it was the pizza memory. That was the first time he truly understood what love was.
Oh, that's amazing. It brings us back to that idea of love as an economy, right? But in this case, it's an economy of generosity and selflessness.
Exactly. And it's not just about giving, it's also about receiving. It's about being open to the love that others offer us, even when it comes in unexpected forms.
I've loved that.
Yeah, me too. And James ended by saying that his experience as a father has deepened his understanding of love even more.
It sounds like this interview really challenged him to confront a lot of his assumptions about love and relationships.
It did. And I think it's given us a lot to think about as well.
Wow. That was a lot to take in.
It was, wasn't it? A lot to think about.
Yeah, James really gave us a lot to chew on. But it was fascinating stuff, really eye-opening.
Absolutely.
So as we wrap things up here, maybe we can try to pull out some of the key takeaways for our listeners. Like, what were the biggest aha moments for you?
Well, one thing that really resonated with me was James's emphasis on honest communication, like really being open and upfront with your partner, even when it's hard.
Yeah, that was huge.
Yeah.
Because it's so easy to just avoid those difficult conversations, right?
It is, but as we heard from James, that avoidance can really backfire. He can lead to all sorts of problems down the line. Resentment, misunderstandings.
It's like that saying, communication is key.
Exactly. And it's not just about talking, it's about listening too. Really hearing what your partner is saying and trying to understand their perspective.
It's about making that effort to connect, even when it's challenging. And another thing that really stuck with me was James's concept of preventative maintenance for relationships.
Oh yeah, I loved that analogy.
It's so true, right? We service our cars, we go to the doctor for checkups, but we often neglect our relationships. We just assume they'll take care of themselves.
And that's a recipe for disaster, right?
It is. So just like we schedule those oil changes and dental appointments, we need to make time for those relationship check-ins.
Those little moments where we can just connect with our partner, see how they're doing, make sure we're both still on the same page.
And it's about expressing appreciation, right? Letting your partner know that you see them and that you value them.
Yes, because those little gestures can go a long way.
They really can. And, even with all the effort in the world, sometimes relationships just don't work out.
That's true. And that's okay.
I thought James's perspective on that was really helpful. He sees relationships as chapters in a longer story. Not every chapter has to be a happy ending.
Right. And sometimes those difficult chapters, the ones that maybe end in heartbreak or disappointment, those are the ones that teach us the most valuable lesson.
They shape us. They help us grow.
They do. And they prepare us for the next chapter.
I love that. And ultimately, it's all about cherishing those connections.
Yeah.
Whether they're romantic or platonic, It's about appreciating the people in our lives and the love that we share.
Beautifully said.
This deep dive has really given me a lot to think about, and I hope it's done the same for our listeners. So as we sign off here, I want to leave you with one final question. If marriage isn't necessarily the be-all and end-all, if it's not a guarantee of happiness or happily ever after, then what does make a relationship truly successful? What do you think?
That's a great question. One that I think we all need to grapple with. There's no easy answer.
There isn't, and I think that's the beauty of it, right?
Yeah.
It's a journey of discovery.
It is. And we're all on that journey together.
We are. So keep exploring, keep learning, keep growing, and most importantly, keep loving.
And keep listening. We'll be back soon with another deep dive.
Until then, happy diving, everyone.